So the Diablo 4 endgame beta has been underway for roughly 2 weeks now. At least that's when reports started popping up of people gaining access. Blizzard sent invites out to a small pool of players to specifically test D4's various endgame systems, which include Helltide region-wide events that unlock upon reaching World Tier 3 Nightmare difficulty. During these Helltide events, enemies on the map become empowered, increasing their difficulty while also dropping better loot. In addition, the number of elite enemies roaming around is ramped up, takes a zone, makes everything harder, gives you some nice rewards and access to these chests. Beyond Helltides, there are Nightmare dungeons. This system unlocks upon locating your very first Nightmare sigil. Each sigil will correspond to one specific dungeon somewhere in the game. You go to that dungeon, enter and activate the sigil, and then this turns the normal dungeon into a Nightmare variation. As you expect, this will make things harder. Specifically, it adds special modifiers to the dungeon and the enemies within, and the increased difficulty in turn, yes, it yields better loot, along with another powerful sigil, like a higher tier, granting you access to another, more difficult version of a Nightmare dungeon. Rinse and repeat. This is the game's closest thing to like Diablo 3 Rifts. However, from what we've seen so far, it appears to be a little slower paced with unique objectives. So instead of like killing monsters to fill up a progress bar and then defeating a boss like you did in D3, you're asked to do stuff kind of like D3 bounty objectives, just within a dungeon. Then there is the Whispers of the Dead system. This is the closest thing to Diablo 3 bounties. These are tasks for you to complete that are scattered all around the game's world. Completing a task gets you experience, gold, and grim favors. They can be exchanged at this thing called the Tree of Whispers, and this is going to give you loot and experience. It's just rotating quest for you to do essentially. And then the final main system of content is the Fields of Hatred, which are designated PvP zones where players can engage in open, free-for-all combat with others, but also enemy NPCs within these zones will drop seeds of hatred. You collect these, bring them to this altar where they can be smashed into red dust, and that dust can be used to purchase PvP cosmetics and mounts. However, if another player catches you as you're trying to convert your seeds into dust, they can kill you, take all of your seeds, and turn it in for themselves. So there's the four like main content systems of things you'll be doing, but then layered on top of that are the Paragon boards, which you unlock upon reaching level 50. It's the endgame character growth system. It's like the endgame long-term progression. Your hero earns experience, they unlock Paragon points, you spend those points to unlock powerful boosts and bonuses, but also things like new titles and sockets. It's a rather interesting form of character development and progression, in addition to the whole gear progression system. So yeah, those are the 5 main systems that we, as far as we currently know, account for a bulk of what Diablo 4 will have for endgame content. Unfortunately though, given that the current test is under NDA, we really have no idea how good or not any of this content is, or we don't know what people think about it because they can't talk about it. False. No, that is false because absolutely everybody is breaking NDA. Demon of the Light 13 is breaking NDA. Go Home Pat You're Drunk, Sarcastic Adbot, Feces of Atheism, and even Gabe Newell himself is out there breaking NDAs to share their experience, leaking info, details, mechanics, and impressions of the beta. And you know what? My sincerest thanks for each of them because there's just a boatload of information and details here. I'm really excited to report that a lot of it is looking really good. The overall tone, the impressions, and just the general feel of the feedback that I've seen online has been generally very positive. I am pumped to jump into today's video, but first, before we do, let's get a word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Vessi. These are comfortable, stylish sneakers you can wear every day that are designed to keep your feet dry in the wettest of weather. Made from Dymatex, a dual climate knit material that keeps you cool in summer and warm in winter, these shoes are comfortable and aren't just water resistant, but are waterproof. I've been wearing these for a while now. It rains a lot where I live, and I have a dog that I take on a couple of walks a day. So if I don't feel like having wet socks the entire time, I just throw these things on and they have worked great. Vessi comes in a few styles for men, women, and children. You can choose between regular sneakers, laceless, or ankle boots. Choose your size and then you can customize colors from there. Some of them also offered in limited patterns and colors, and you get free shipping as well as a 90-day return policy on orders over $80. So if you're interested in Vessis, check them out using the link below. Head on over to Vessi.com for a pair of shoes, and by using my code, you can get $25 off each pair of adult Vessi shoes ordered. So yeah, lots of people breaking their NDA to share their experience of the D4 endgame beta. And while it doesn't seem like we're getting a lot of like detailed criticism about the actual systems of the various features, there just have been a lot of general overall impressions and thoughts, and also some points of concern and criticism. I want to start off with some of the positive stuff though, because like I said, that is predominantly what I've been seeing. So one of the first things I pulled was just talking about the game's combat system and overall feel. It said combat is so smooth and responsive. D3's engine and combat are unparalleled, but D4 actually feels better out the gate. Controls are tighter and more snappy. Talked about how when you spin around in D3, there's a little bit of the small turn radius. Well, that is gone in D4, so everything is quicker, your character's moving around and more responsive to your inputs. And then also it looks like they've increased flow of combat because it doesn't have that initial clunkiness that those first few levels of D3 have, which I totally know what he's talking about here. Whenever I start up a brand new season in D3, or just originally I remember when playing through the campaign, things started really slow, the game felt a little slower paced, and I know it's the natural progression as your character powers up and as you get better gear for the overall speed of things to ramp up, but it seems pretty much out the gate that the speed and the feel of combat is better. That is saying a lot because as it is, Diablo 3 I think still has some of the best feeling combat in the ARPG genre. I've played a bit of Path of Exile as well, and that game feels a little off, just not quite as crisp as D3 to me. I would say the closest ARPG to the heft and the responsiveness would actually probably be Lost Ark. I think that's a game that's come the closest to feel like this game. It's got a really nice feel to it. D3 and Lost Ark I'd put near the cream of the crop, just in my personal experience. They went on to mention that they felt the skill tree was extremely deep. They like how Blizzard is going back to this more complex ability customization, and that is also really good to hear. It's one of those things though that it's really hard to verify, how deep, how complex it is, especially since you should really keep in mind with everything that we're going to take a look at here today, this is coming from people who have played a beta for under 2 weeks now. I think it's about 12 days it's been since people started being able to download the client and jump in, and that's assuming that servers kicked on right away. It is a overall limited amount of time in like the grand scale of ARPG playtimes. It's just a couple of weeks. So when you talk about things like itemization, long-term progression, but then also the depth and complexity of stuff, really not going to get down to the bottom of it in just a couple of weeks of playtime, assuming that these people have been playing nonstop for 2 weeks, which probably isn't the case for most of them. I'm happy to hear that the combat seems really, really solid. That is probably for me the number one most important thing, or it is at least what has me enjoying playing a game the most. What of course keeps me sticking around are a lot of the systems and features and things to do, which, speaking of which, we had someone talk about how similar Diablo 4 feels and compared to Lost Ark, which for me is a positive, barring a few specifications. This coming from a thread titled Diablo 4 feels so similar to Lost Ark, in which they said you have mounts, you can stagger bosses, an open world map with world events and random quests that pop up in the zones as you complete, and can do this with other members who are not partied with you. He went on to say it feels like he's playing Lost Ark 2 rather than playing Diablo 4. They added a ton of MMO elements to the game. This is something that we have known about. There are a lot of MMO like features, which again is very akin to what Lost Ark does, and this has kind of pushed the game into feeling more of like an open world adventure than a traditional hack and slash game. They also touched on the fact that dungeons are really dense to feel worth it compared to the open world maps, and you can reset the dungeons at any time. It feels like kind of a halfway solution between rifts and maps. And I did see a lot of discussion about the dungeon system in this game in general, about people liking the way it was implemented in here, but on the reverse side of that, a lot of discussion, and I'll touch on it later when we dive into some of the negative feedback that we've seen. A lot of discussion about the open world feeling a bit too light, especially on enemies, and we saw numerous complaints of the game feeling a bit like a walking simulator when you are out in the open play space, but then having these really cool, high-octane, action-packed dungeons. I think in general that should be the balance. The dungeons should be more condensed and have a lot more going on moment to moment, but hopefully the open world isn't super empty so that you are spending most of your time walking around. But I think there can be some of that. It doesn't have to be monsters on every screen pan. As you're constantly walking, every single few meters, new enemies are start popping up. I don't think it needs to be that dense because that kind of takes away the point of having a big open world, in my opinion. Some level of exploration, I think, is good for the overall feel of an open world game. One tester said that they feel that Diablo 4 is like a combination of D3, Immortal, and World of Warcraft, saying, to me, D4 is a combination of those three games, which I think is fantastic. There is so much to do rather than just running rifts and bounties. It rewards exploration and grinding. They've done a great job, and I'm looking forward to it. I absolutely love hearing that because that's probably one of my biggest complaints whenever I come back to Diablo 3. I feel like all there is to do is run rifts and do bounties. Now, I know that over time, Diablo 3 has added other systems. They have added other features and things to engage with in the end game. But regardless, it always feels like the two main things that I should be doing is just running rift after rift, getting keys, and then running greater rifts, and then doing bounties when I need the materials, and just complete that process over and over again. And so I'm really hoping that with D4, they can have enough incentive into each of the systems, because like we touched on, there appear to be 4 main activity types in Diablo 4's endgame, and then the progression of the Paragon boards, even just having those extra layers, especially with some of those types being varied, having complete zone-wide events that will rotate which zones the event is taking place on with the Hell Tides, and then also the Fields of Hatred doing kind of the same thing but for PvP, and then the Tree of Whispers being the quest that you go out on, and then of course the hard mode version, the Nightmare Dungeons. Having a healthy mix of activities for us to work towards, all of which will bring meaningful progression, because that's the other thing. If any of these systems don't bring some level of meaningful progression, odds are a lot of players, with the exception of the first couple of weeks where people are just excited to try out everything, in the long term, you don't want to make it so that one activity is the primary thing you're doing. And I really feel like probably the best way to do that is to have different paths of progression. So resources you can only get by doing this activity and then that activity, to give the incentive, because we're going to min-max. We're going to do the thing that's going to be the quickest way of getting the reward that we want, however, whatever sort of power progression that ends up meaning. So forcing players, basically forcing them into the different activities by having almost exclusive rewards, or if you don't want to do that, make sure everything is spread out evenly, but that is a real difficult task. So we'll have to see how they can incentivize all of these different activities. Okay, this next bit here was talking about the comparisons that were popping up between D3 and D4. They said that they noticed a lot of people calling D4 a reskin of D3, but how having played it feels completely different. For one, talking about the fact that there are tons of powerful builds you can use, the new skill tree and the Paragon tree, the fact that legendary and set items aren't constantly raining from the sky, and that even rare items are pretty rare now. I'm of two minds on this. You do want to have some semblance of loot pinata, but you don't want it to be so crazy. And I at least feel like D3 was a little bit overboard with the number of items that were constantly dropping as you push into those like higher tier of rifts. It just feel like inventory management is a part of these games, but when it becomes the thing that I'm spending the most amount of time doing in between runs, just constantly going through, are any of these minor upgrades compared to the ones that I have? Okay, no. Do I have to salvage these? It becomes really, really tedious and takes away from the enjoyment. So have it so that when loot drops, it is exciting. That is the goal, right? And I hope that's something that they can work towards. They talk about the fact that gold actually has a high amount of value now, especially since it gives you a good chance of getting powerful items. There is no seemingly cap to the amount of gold that you're going to want. I presume here that they are talking about the fact that there is basically a gambling vendor, and that gambling vendor does have the chance to yield some of the best items in the game. So the more gold you have, the more you can gamble, the higher chance you have of getting items that you might want or trade if they are if they fall within the sphere of items that are tradable, which absolutely isn't everything. They said that the gameplay also feels improved from Diablo 3, feels much better, not to mention the huge amount of content and features the game has, along with the open world. They went on to talk about how they really like the music in the game, which is a nice addition. Of course, music does add a lot to the play experience if you're not one of those people who just mute it and run your Spotify list in the background. And then they wrap up by saying that D4 feels more akin to Diablo 1 than Diablo 2. It's got the dark atmosphere and all of that. And yeah, it's just looking really, really good. This is all really good, exciting news for me. And then finally, the other main post that I want to touch on was just in general saying that D4 from their experience is awesome. This thread was kind of funny because they were basically saying everything about being in the beta, also circumventing saying that they were in the beta. It opens up with, if I was in the beta, I wouldn't be able to tell you that this game is a love child between D2R and D Immortal, heavily favoring the Immortal side, especially with its systems and open world play. I don't believe he's referring to monetization there. I think he's just generally talking about the open multiplayer MMO nature of the game. I don't think I'd be able to tell you that I see many players in town, and half the quest and public events have had at least one other player helping me. I don't remember D3 having talent trees and +2 skills stats on its gear like Diablo 4 may or may not have. I couldn't tell you that there's a horse for purchase as your mount, or that there's herbalism, mining, and skinning. That is something we found out when we saw the leaks a few weeks ago, or like a month or so ago, that the game basically has traditional gathering systems. While you're out in the world, you're going to see ore and herbs and stuff like that, and you'll be able to skin apparently as well. Just classic MMO gathering for crafting, right? Then they said, I remember feeling alone in Diablo 3, loot raining from the heavens and uniques not existing. I can't say if I had the exact opposite experience for each of those categories in this new selective access game I just recently started playing, but who knows, because if I was in D4's beta, I wouldn't be able to talk about it. So yes, they are in the beta and they're talking about all of the stuff, and overall it's generally positive. I selfishly really love all of the MMO elements, and I know this is kind of highly debated within the Diablo community because it is a series that originally started as a single player offline game, and then it's slowly morphed over time with the constant connectivity of Diablo 3, and now it's basically like an MMO. And I feel like there might be a lot of people who are like traditional fans of the early iteration of the game and are sad that it's moved in this direction, but personally I prefer this style. Keep in mind as well, they have specifically talked about how the open world, you will be running into people, you will see them occasionally as you're doing quests and stuff, and of course you will see them in town. There's probably going to be concentrated numbers of people there, but specifically when you go into one of the game's over 100 different dungeons, or when you're doing some story stuff, that will be instanced just to you. So they are finding a balance, but yeah, it is an MMO light. It is an MMO ARPG. Huh, get it? Okay, a couple other quick things. We saw a thread talking about how they felt the end game was better in D4 than D3. The core fundamentals of the game's design seem pretty good to me, like D3, but with a lot more depth and an interconnected end game with multiple goals and objectives instead of just greater rifts. Love it. Absolutely love it. And we've touched on this all throughout this video so far. The idea that they're going to have a lot more activities than just running greater rifts plus bounties as well, which they leaved out here. That sounds amazing to me. I really hope, again, that they can incentivize all of these different activities. Now, while the overall tone of what I've seen and this video in general is positive, it's talking about some of the great aspects of the game, there were also quite a bit of complaints that I saw while perusing different forums and threads talking about it. One of the main ones, as I touched on earlier, was the expansiveness of the open world and how that's made it feel like it's really empty. So one complaint about there being too much running said that the game has a bad loop. There's far too much running through empty screens to reach a waypoint on your map, skipping past the few monsters you do see on your horse. Usually you are running to some daily or quest or bounty that you've already actually done. D2 and 1 feel very different because you're always fighting to progress something, but that isn't the case in D4. It feels more like an MMO and it feels more empty. A follow-up thread, also calling it a walking simulator, said that the maps are all messy and full of dead ends, not nearly enough mobs in the open world, like run for 30 seconds and kill 5 mobs in 5 seconds, then run all the way back to where you came from to another dead end. That is a concern. As I touched on, I do think that there should be a balance. I don't think you should have just monsters at every corner in an open world game, but there is a balance there, and maybe this is the sort of feedback they need to increase mob density. You also have to consider too, and maybe part of this is just the level design, the zone design, two things. We're leveling up, and while leveling up to max level, we are going through and we have this pacing of combat. But remember, at max level in D4, that is when you unlock the mount. And obviously, the spaces in between combat encounters will be shortening when you have access to your mount. It seems like they could be running into the issue where the game might be designed all across the board in the open world for the idea of players having mounts, but that is making the leveling experience feel way too sparse when it comes, again, to mob density. So I guess we'll have to see how and if they balance that, but then also if it even matters, because if D3 is any indication, once people get familiar with the game after their first playthrough, they'll be leveling up to max level in a couple of hours tops. Like, that's how it is a lot of times in ARPGs like this, especially seasonal ones, right? So it might not even matter at all if past the first playthrough, people are leveling up so quickly that it doesn't matter how it is before you have your mount, because you're going to get your mount in an afternoon. Now, unsurprisingly, one other issue that I have seen come up is just that there are a lot of issues with a beta, which, you know, beta is not a complete product, but here are some of the complaints that I saw. Lag issues. For some reason, the game uses up to 21 gigs of RAM. There's this magic bubble bug that causes enemies' health to reset to full. Lightning orb mobs doing like 15,000 times too much damage. And they went on to list a few more complaints about issues with bugs and stuff. Someone was also asking about itemization, saying that no one is complaining about graphics, sound design, atmosphere. Most people are praising the art direction and assuming the gameplay is good. It's itemization and game systems that people are most concerned about, and some people are saying those feel a lot like D3. And yeah, that's really the rub here in a situation like this, because we're taking feedback from people who have been in the beta for a couple of weeks. That long-term progression, that hook that's going to keep people around for a long time, those are of the utmost important for the long-term health of the game. Like, it's fantastic if the gameplay feels good and crunchy, if there's a lot of interesting systems, so that on the first playthrough, those first few days, those first few weeks, the game is fun, it stays interesting. But the long-term itemization, how they vary up the end game, all of those things, how they manage the game's various economies, that is the most important for the long-term health. If this game is not only just going to be baseline fun, but if it's going to be long-term fun. And then I also saw a few complaints about this being like an MMO. People saying that as solo players, this is not the direction they want the game to take. They don't like seeing other people around. They don't like the MMO elements. They don't like the gathering. They don't like the mounts. And this is just going to be one of those situations where people will be divided. As I said, some people are going to like this system. Some people are going to be more traditional Diablo fans and prefer a single player experience and absolutely hate it. Personally, as I've made clear enough, I think I really, really like it. I love the MMO nature, and it's part of the reason I'm very excited for Diablo 4. So yeah, we touched on a lot of different things here, and overall, I'm just happy to see that the general reception from the NDA breakers that have come out so far, the stuff that's been posted online, the general reception has been very positive. We still have the concern of it being a relatively short amount of time though, and a lot of Blizzard games immediately feel great. In fact, pretty much every Blizzard game I've ever played immediately feels really great. Not all of them manage to keep me around long term. They have, of course, made plenty of games that I've sunk a lot of time into. World of Warcraft, years of my life have been spent in that game, and that's really no exaggeration. They have made games that can keep people interested and engaged and coming back time after time, but not everything is that, and I really don't even feel like Diablo 3 is that. I know I talk about how I'll go back every season to just to check it out just for the fun of it, but that's primarily because I like playing the game. The base of the game, the actual gameplay is really, really enjoyable, but that runs dry for me after a couple of days as I'm pushing up those rift keys, because I am playing it mostly solo, so I'm not going crazy pushing or anything. I'll level up my character in an afternoon, find a build to do, I'll work towards those different gear pieces. I'm running rift after rift after rift after rift, and it just gets very, very boring, very monotonous, so they need that varied activity. And it does sound like they have a lot in the works, and I am ultra excited for their open world PvP stuff. I'm going to be really interested to see how they manage to balance, if they do some sort of scaling of power for people within the fields of hatred, or if it's just going to be free for all, the gear that you have. If you're completely overpowered, you're just going to dominate people. I'm not sure. I think a lot of those questions are as of yet unanswered. At least I personally don't know off the top of my head, but we'll see. Either way, there's some really, really cool things about Diablo 4 from what I'm hearing from these people, and I am looking forward to jumping in and checking it out myself at some point. And hey, the game is supposed to be out at some time next year, and it is almost next year. I'm thinking springish, maybe like March, April, I don't know, somewhere around there. That'd be great. We'll see. But that's it for today. I think D4 is looking and sounding very good from what I'm hearing, and yeah, I'm excited. Looking forward to finding out more. But also, there's a lot of concerns, and many of which, especially monetization side of things, we didn't even touch on in this video. I'll save that for another topic. We'll make a video of why Diablo 4's beta looks awful, because this is why it sounds awesome. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, see you next time.